All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this week's PhD colloquium. My name is David Sun. I'm a final year PhD candidate, advised by Professor Barry Silverman with the Alcove Collaboratory for Advancement of System Approaches. So I was told that someone's supposed to give an introduction, but I'll just introduce myself, and that will suffice. So in the past 2 weeks, we talked about things like, how robotics stand up for transitional mobility, and this time we're talking about something else. As you probably guessed from the title, it sounds pretty big, but we're going to talk about small things in the bigger picture. We're trying to understand coalition dynamics in the multi-party conflicts with the approach of agent-based application and also the multi-objective nature of those games. And we'll explain each of the terms later. So to get started, a little bit of background. So CASA itself is focused on behavioral science for research at the frontiers of mathematical, of chaos and nonlinear dynamics, emergent behavior simulation, decision modeling, and informatics for complex mechanical, biological, and social systems. We also have one of the platforms we devote most of our efforts at, which is StateSim. It's a modeling capability to simulate intra- and interstate conflicts. And the subcomponents include simulation for market economics, population, military conflicts, and so forth. And as for I myself, I did a bit of network science, and then the rest of the research is on data science, simulation, agent-based modeling, and those. So the overview to today's presentation will start basically by talking about the problem itself, followed by a review of literature, the most prominent models in the past half a century to a century. And then we'll talk about the two models and the motivation for doing two models under the framework to solve the problem. One of them being the abstract model. We'll propose some formal definitions, a few lemmas and propositions from there. And then we'll talk about the agent-based model a little bit with a discussion of some preliminary results from simulations. And conclude with a Q&A or future work. So the problem statement, the question in study is very simple. It's how can we better model coalition dynamics in multi-party competitive situations with multiple objectives in play? There are three keywords here. The first one being multi-party, so you want a game with multiple players. Competitiveness means that they have to compete for a limited utility amount that's available in the context. And the last but not least, the multi-objective is that there are different objectives the agents are trying to reach that are on different dimensions. And we'll get a clearer picture of that when explaining the objectives and the policy space. The importance for the query itself, so I think coalition formation and fragmentation itself is a very important subject in a variety of contexts. If you think about civil wars, international relations, or just corporate alliances at large, and the forming of these kind of strategic partnerships dictates the outcome of many competitions, and not to say the rise and fall of great powers in terms of the countries falling apart or coming together. The necessity of the query, so why am I doing this? Why do we do it in the ABM approach? Why do we study it in a multi-objective framework? There are two. The first thing is that we would like to bridge the gap between existing set of theories, and as you will see, there are many coalition theories stem from different fields of study, and they are similar in a way. They're different, they're complementary, but there's not really much of a computational model that binds everything together to solve most of the limitations each model somewhat carries. The second is to apply advanced computational modeling methods to uncover the previously underexplored insights. The coalition theories developed and pretty much started almost a century ago if you count international relations and war theories. But if you think about coalition itself, theories probably started in the 60s and 70s. The computational modeling capacity, so the computing capacity didn't start until about 2 decades ago for such kind of models, and not to mention agent-based models itself. So now is the time probably to look at those theories and say, what can we do if we apply a higher and greater computational capacity to it? The scope of work, there are three primary things we're trying to achieve here. The first one is to consolidate the major theories in coalition formation with a consideration to the context of intrastate conflicts, which means the conflicts within a country, and to construct assumptions at both the system and agent level. The second being to focus on the impact of multi-objective nature and competitive games, and allow differentiation agent attributes and decision-making mechanism in the agent-based model. And then we also want to allow the characterization of equilibrium states in the abstract version of the model and explore more complex dynamics in the agent-based version of the model. So there are two versions of the model in the framework. For one, that we're trying to propose formal definitions, understand equilibrium, and the other, we try to allow differentiation, unique characterization of different agents in play to, through simulation to see different outcomes. So in terms of relevant literature, they're falling into two parts. The one being the predominant coalition series. I'd like to go a quick review of half a century of the models and series. They primarily stem from three realms of study. The first being the coalitions in the context of international relations and war. The second being spatial series in legislative institutions, where we talk about ideology and objectives. The third being game theoretical models, where it's slightly more recent, and there's a lot of interesting concepts like the stability, the core, and consistent sets. And then we'll briefly touch upon the three fairly recent and very important agent-based models that touch upon the topic of coalition formation in the multi-objective scenarios. So let's get started. The coalition in the context of international relations and war started with Rousset in the 70s, and there are four basic kind of conditions for the context. The first being at least there are three or more nations in play, multi-party nature. The second being the situation is at least partly competitive, so you have the motivation to play the game. The third being there are no single nation in a dominant position to win by itself, so the nations are somewhat forced to form coalitions in order to win. The last being there are payoffs or losses associated with these divisions. So the choices you make about the alliances you form will dictate your payoff. There are basically two narratives in this field on the motivation for coalition formation for international relations and war. The first one being primarily proposed by Waldbaum and Gleister, ideological based. So they argue the countries form alliances because of ideology, the shared values and things of that nature. The second being the power-based with Liska Reiche. And so they say, we don't quite care about ideologies. We care primarily about power, and everything in IR and war is about survival. In order to survive, you have to be in a coalition that's powerful enough to withstand any aggressor. And from that very belief stem out two theory solution concepts. The one being the minimum winning coalition, which means you want to be in a coalition that's just sizable enough to ensure your success, but not too big that dilutes your own winnings. These are implications for our own models proposals. The second being the balancing versus bandwagon behaviors. And we actually have a short example right after this slide. And there also has been quite a bit of discussion on the reliability of the coalitions in this context. I think a lot of people think if we form alliance, we're talking about friendship, we're talking about promises, things like pacta sunt servanda, the Latin word for promises are always kept. Unfortunately, no. Basically, by the Correlates of War project, which was actually done by Small Singer in 1982, they studied the civil wars over, around one and a half century. Only a quarter of the time such promises are kept, and often they're just broken. I think the reason for that and the insights we derive from there is that the alliances and coalition itself is not a static concept. It is a dynamic concept. It is a state of the competitive games, and it will change as the situation changes. And that provides the motivation to study the dynamics of it. So a short example here about balancing versus bandwagon, and it's also which I call a mini minimum winning coalition case study. So if you think about the scenario 1 and 2 here, which is scenario 1, scenario 2, with three agents in play, A having a power of 20, B have a 50, and C have a 60, and you basically can tell if C, so in this scenario, C is always the aggressor towards B. And if C goes on attack on B, I will look at it and say, I'd like to form a balancing coalition with B to deter this aggressive behavior. But in the case of C being extremely powerful, that having a power of 90, that even an alliance of A and B wouldn't work. While the aggression is happening from C towards B, that the agent A, in most of the cases, the country A, the smaller country A, would simply choose to join the more powerful country to bandwagon. And I think the idea here is very simple, is that, so C is aggressor, it initiates an act, changes the situation, changes the state of the game, and then A, being the decision maker, looks around and say, what is my minimum winning coalition? So in the first situation, B is my minimum winning coalition partner. In the second situation, I don't have a choice. I'll just join C, so I wouldn't get eliminated. So let's move on to spatial theories in the legislative institution context. So the idea of policy space was first proposed by Laver and Shapsel in the 90s. It is something that extends beyond the size principle. So a lot of people, when they initially started the cabinet formations, it's all about size. So you want to form coalitions that's sizable enough for you to become the winning party or winning coalition. But Laver and Shapsel study a lot of the cases and real cabinet formations, and they say, this is in a non-cooperative multi-party proposal game where you have a unique position in the policy space and you assign different utility values. We're able to achieve the results that correlates better with the empirical findings. So the idea of the policy space is simply an Euclidean space where you have directions, and on each dimension you have opposing views on a singular issue. So if you think about the policy dimension of socialism versus liberalism, and then from the far left you have extreme socialism going to moderate socialism, the center point, the moderate liberalism, all the way to the extreme end of the spectrum. So this also can be multidimensional. So as illustrated here, it's actually a direct graph from the Laver and Shapsel paper, is that different parties occupy different points in the policy space, and they have a boundary beyond which they would not consider a proposal, but any proposal within the boundary would be considered valid, and the further away it is, the less appealing it is. Right. So there are a few limitations to it. For one, that while Laver and Shapsel actually studies the policy space, it doesn't quite take into consideration the power while they talk about the positions. The second being that they don't really regard this as a continuous thing. It is relatively discrete, and you only have a few data points you pick from the set, and whatever that works will be the unstable set. There's another thing that is actually interesting in the legislative literature, the bargaining process. And we'll just skip the detailed rules and set of rules about bargaining, but just talk about one finding as Gamson's law of proportionality. And so the implication is that the payoff at the end of the game depends primarily on the coalition structure rather than the bargaining process itself. And if you look at this chart here, what it says here is that if you look at the share of government legislative seats and the share of government, so this is basically your power, and the more you have towards one, the stronger you are in terms of influence in the parliament. And then this is the share of the seats in the government, which is essentially the payoff. So the more seats you have in the government, the better winnings you're getting. And the blue and the red dots are the ones initiating the formation of alliances, and the ones that are not, and simply following and joining an alliance. And you see a direct correlation, and you don't really see a difference in spreading between the two, which are the formators, the ones forming it, and the ones not. And that means we basically can derive utility with limited concern on the process itself, but simply on the topology of the coalition structure. Now we'll talk about the game theory models. And so the first category is cooperative games. And the cooperative games, the cooperative word means every single action the participating players take have to be approved by everybody. So they have to be a joint, determinant decision to change the state of the game. The setting is formally you have a set of N players, and a coalition is a non-empty subset of N. You denote coalitions by S and T. In cooperative game theory, a characteristic function is introduced, assigns a set of payoff factors to every coalition. And then we have the concept blocking here. So there are two variations of the payoffs. One is transferable utility, which means the members of a coalition can share the total utility and payoff from the structure. And non-transferable means you basically are given the utility based on the characteristic payoff factor. With a different blocking concept, but the whole idea here about blocking is that if you have a state and you do not have another state which leads to a better payoff for any single player from your current state, it means you are unblocked. And the idea of the core is that you have the set of all unblocked allocations. So you assign the payoffs in a way such that there are no other states would lead to a better payoff. And that is what it defines as a core, and basically equivalent of the idea of stability, stable states. There are a few criticisms for this concept of the core. The first one is that it's not necessarily non-empty. So the theories who propose the core don't really talk about what happens when the core does not exist. The core exists, but it's empty. And also it's solely based on the end state. It tells no story about the actual dynamics. There are a few suggested improvements about the concept of the core, primarily 4 of those. The first one being farsightedness, because when you think about game theory, a lot of the equilibrium concepts are about Markov perfect equilibrium, or subgame natural equilibrium in general in extensive games. And those are simply counting what happens every next step. So when you introduce a farsightedness, what agents evaluate is 2 steps ahead, and if it behaves in a way that increases the utility in the next step, but it will lead to a state that's worse off than the current state, it will be deterred from acting. The second being replacement of characteristic functions, and that's been done, and a variety of models have different payoff functions they have characterized. And then there's also the credibility versus payoff, but a relatively more interesting one, and that's actually grew a lot, is the non-cooperative games, where you don't really require a joint determinant action to change the state of the game. So the setting is basically about proposal making in discrete time. So a set of players start out without any membership, any coalition, so they just treat them as singletons of the coalition. At the beginning of each round, in discrete time game, a predefined Bayesian protocol selects one player as the proposer, and then the proposer, which is chosen in this round, shall freely make any particular plausible payoff allocation to any subset of the players to form a coalition. And then this proposal is passed on to each of the players in the proposed coalition in a sequential manner. If all involved players accept the proposal, because it's non-cooperative, so everybody has to agree on their own, and then the proposed coalition is formed, and the players will leave the game, or remaining players enter the next round. Otherwise, the proposal fails, the entire set of players move on to the next round. So there are a few variations to this very setting as well, and essentially surrounding the choice of proposer. So some would have a protocol to choose the proposal for each round. Some are just randomly chosen. And the elapse of time, there are ones that's more complicated with continuous times that depends on the payoff and the interaction involved. And then there's also the binding versus non-binding proposals. I think the improved setting we see, once you accept the proposal, you leave the game and no longer are available to any other coalition proposals. In that case, it's binding. Sometimes you stay in the game and you can go on the next round and play the game again. It's non-binding. And there's also the payoffs. So some of those have the idea of an end game payoff. So until you reach a core or stable state of the game, you get a payoff. Some say you get the payoff mid-game. But these variations don't really significantly change the way the equilibrium states would be. And many of those, except the earlier talked ones on farsightedness and also the replacement of characteristic functions, those variations within the non-cooperative games don't quite change those states. Okay, so we have talked about the cooperative and non-cooperative games in a variety of settings. And what I find interesting is that they actually share a lot of commonalities in terms of the solution concept and equilibrium states. So if we look at the Markov perfect equilibrium strategies in coalition dynamics, that where we have each player moves only depending on the current situation. So it's memoryless, and then the player is primarily concerned with the payoff associated with each coalition structure. So it depends on the topology of the coalition structure. The last being that I always attempt to act in a way to maximize the payoff in the current state, regardless of possible moves by other players. So they're unaware of the other people, and it is behaving in a Nash optimal way. So it can, whenever it can profit itself, it will make that move with no regard to the actual utility outcomes for other players in the game. And I think a very simple abstract understanding of the equilibrium state in most of the game theoretical models is that we argue that equilibrium state is reached when no player can unilaterally make any move to improve its own payoff. So that's very clear. And I mentioned earlier that Farsighted has changed this very definition a lot because there are situations when a particular player do have the capacity to make a unilateral move to increase its own utility, but if you do farsightedness property in it, you see that it will lead to a worse off state than when you are at the moment, and it will deter the agent from doing so. And that will change the equilibrium states, and also in many ways make the core concept non-empty. So, and we'll talk about it in a bit when we look at the state diagrams. So a simple game for the game theory. So we look at two agents, 1 and 2, and they're both able to alter the state of the game, any to any. And there are 4 states of the game, A, B, C, D, with respective preferences for the 4 states that's following. So for the agent 1, you have A, B, C, D. So D is the most preferred, C the second, and A is the worst. And then agent 2, you have B being the worst, and it prefers D, and then A, and then on towards to C. There are 4 scenarios of the game. I'll talk about equilibrium and outcomes associated with those. So the first one here, I should explain the chart here as well. So for the blue one, an error from a state to another means it's preferred. So if you think about the walk from the state diagram, if agent 2 is not allowed to move at all, what agent 1 will be doing is just move along its preference order and end up in D. And similarly, the green arrows represent that for the agent 2. If you are looking at myopic agents in a non-cooperative game, you basically know AB will not be a stable state in any sense, or because it's always worse off for both agents' perspective. You look at, if we are starting off or ending up somewhere in the middle of the game as state A, no matter it's the turn for the agent 1 or 2 to act, you can see it is always preceded by C, and C is preferred by both agent 1 and 2, so move on. And similar thing can be said about state B, where you can move to D, and it's both preferred by 1 and 2. But in a myopic non-cooperative game setting, this would not have an unstable state. You basically have a cycle. You just keep moving, and there's no equilibrium state, and that's fine. The second scenario is the farsightedness non-cooperative game, and you basically find you'll be in a state D or C. If you look at C or D, that you know, I'll just talk about one state, I guess. So if you're in D and it's agent 1's turn to move, you will not do so, because if you do so, this is already an ideal state. But if it's for agent 2 to move, in a far-sighted sense, you know that for D, you prefer to move to A or preferably C. But if you move to C, you know agent 1 will move you to D, and you will basically end up being the same. And if you move to A, the agent 1 is very likely to move to B, which is probably the least preferable state for you. And being far-sighted, you will deter from action, and therefore you can actually reach equilibrium there and a stable state. And there's also the cooperative game idea, so very simple. You would think about D and C, and both of them are acceptable. And there's the transferable utility non-cooperative games. We don't really have much of a discussion here because those are not numerical, and you can't really talk about the transferable utility without having a value. And then, so that is pretty much the coalition series from the 3 realms of study: international relations, legislative institution, and game theoretical models. And now we turn to the agent-based modeling. So agent-based model is a subsection of the computational modeling approach. We model individual players in a game. We assign unique characteristics to it. We give them unified or individual decision-making mechanisms, and we let them interact with each other. And the agents are independent. The simulation can run for, financially large amount of time as we wish, and we observe the outcomes and compare them. There are a few key assumptions about agents in ABMs. There are 4 of them I find universally accepted across different ABM models. The first one being that they are self-contained autonomous. So an agent is independent, just like human beings. You have your own characteristics, you have your own decision-making mechanisms. The agents are also interdependent because the dynamics of the simulation in a VM depends on the social or any kind of interaction between the agents and its environment. The third one being that agents follow rules, and they're often utilitarian. Well, I mean, they're utilitarian in most of the macroeconomic models. The fourth one being they can be adaptive and have memory, but in our setting, they are memoryless, and they can be adaptive, as we'll see. Well, with these four key assumptions, and most of the, these are actually the key characteristics of many of the agents in ABM, sounds like perfect thing to use for modeling coalition dynamics. So there are three models on coalition dynamics with multi-objective scenarios. The first one being the development model, where we had the PMF server and social cultural games. It was primarily focused on human behavior modeling. We synthesized the cognitive science models and a lot of those things, and we built things like a GSP tree where we have the goals, the standards, and preferences for the agents, the set of rules by which they will act and make choices. And as an extension of it, we built a leader sim back in 2006. Well, the lab built a leader sim back in 2006 with multi-objective interactions. An interesting phenomenon at the time we observed was that at the beginning of a run, when we had fictional states with three leaders, and the primary interactions at the time when you begin the game, many of them are just military conflicts. When the other states become weaker, it no longer becomes a primary objective, and they'll move on and do other things. So there's a shift of attention there with the lapse of time. And it was pretty interesting because it basically touched upon the multi-objective nature of those. And when we extended the game, in the later version of the state sim, we observed even more interesting dynamics about coalition formation and fragmentation among those countries. The two other ones are the BDM model, so Bruno de Mesquita, and then the Centrium model, Centrium Cooperation. It also uses the agent-based model approach, but it's focused largely on a single issue analysis, and it's a deterministic model they had. So a brief overview of the Centrium model. So the BDM model, Professor de Mesquita never really quite published the exact equations of his own model. I don't know, for intellectual property concerns. And Centrium model is published with a released report. The two actually got into a lawsuit about who stole whose idea. But they're pretty similar in a way. The Centrium model starts off with the two dimensions, the one being the power and the other being your position on a one-dimensional policy space. And then what it does is through iteration, you think about, do you want to join this person? What is the payoff associated with that new position? And then you have this evolution of dynamics here. And this is basically, so this is the initialization. This is the mid-game look of the distribution of players with the power among different policy positions. This is the end game state where you see that they somehow converge around the center point, which means an agreement is reached. And this is the time series analysis here. So through the ticks, you see different parties in a conflict scenario coming together. And so the problem with the Centrium model is that while it does perfect analysis in terms of the defining utility functions with the policy space payoffs and also power considerations, it is it's simply focused on a singular issue and does not really attempt to explore the evolution of the state of coalition structures. And its primary focus is simply looking at the end graph and say, we have most of the players converging at one point in the policy space, and therefore there would not be a conflict. And the other things will be, you have two bars on two ends, and they would say there will be a conflict. So it's almost a binary outcome here, conflict or no conflict. Well, having discussed about what other people have been doing in the field, we'll turn to what we attempt to do. And as we probably understand, the problem itself entails two parts. One being, what are the important characteristics, an extension or addition to the existing game theoretical model that we can make it more meaningful and having a greater empirical significance. The second question is that with the complexity of problem increases, how can we ensure we're still able to derive meaningful results when we're not able to find a tractable solution in the abstract model using the computation modeling approach. So the motivations and basically the goals for the abstract model is to synthesize the major theories on collision formation, extend the non-cooperative games with exogenous utility functions, and focus on multi-objective nature of collision dynamics. And we'll also attempt to characterize the equilibrium states in a more abstract, simplified setting. And then on the other hand, in the agent-based model, we try to implement the abstract model with more sophistication. We try to utilize the ABM approach and the capability of computation modeling to validate the findings we have from the abstract model and derive solution concept for more complex problems. So we look at the abstract model itself. There are a few basic ingredients. It's pretty similar. I would say maybe 30% of the basic ingredients are borrowed from the non-cooperative games. You have a set of n players in a game, a coalition defined as a non-empty, unordered subset of the n. And then if we recall concept partitioning in set theory, we define the coalition structure. So the coalition structure as a partition pi of n, of the n players. Essentially, it is an unordered set of the non-empty subsets, which is the unordered set of the coalitions of n, such that every player in n is exactly contained in one of the subsets. In this model, we often refer to the particular coalition structure as the state of the game. So if you, I think I had the chart somewhere. That's easier to, yeah. So if you think about n equals 4 scenario, and a partitioning here, so S1, S0 is a partitioning. So each one is in its own coalition. S1 is another partitioning, S2 is another one. This is what we call coalition structure. At the same time, because the state of the game solely depends on the structure of coalitions, this is also what we define as the state of the game. And then we let the uppercase pi denotes the set of all possible coalition structures, or the states of the game. And in the model, we basically say there are a few concepts here about the past dependencies. So in the state diagram, if you were to construct such a scene, you would say a one player and one state, pi j, is one player different from pi k, if and only if there exists exactly one player in n, such that by moving the player I in one of the following ways in pi k, it becomes relevant, it becomes equivalent to pi j, or vice versa. So I think it's easy to illustrate with the chart here is that. So you see that S0 and S1 is what we call one player different. Because for the S0 to S1, what you have is you simply have one joining 3 and forming a lines, and then you would have this, right? And similarly, S1 to S0, the S1 simply leave this alliance and be on its own, and it'll be fine. So, and then, basically we'll write this, represent this as an arrow and a 1, saying that's the notion of one player difference. And also it's symmetrical, very easy to understand. Okay, I think there was also, and then we further build upon the concept of a one player difference. We also say a state pi j is n player different from pi k, if and only if we're able to identify an ordered list containing only the minimum number of necessary states, such that you have one player difference between each of the elements in a sorted order. And we further mandate that must exist no other ordered list containing less than n minus 1 states, so that you would say n player difference, because you're able to find a shorter sorted list of the states to go from j to k. Just think about it, a graph. And then that's the shortest path. And a similar expression, we'll write such a thing, and saying that pi j and k are n player different. And I think we already talked about this here. And now we talk about the preferences a little bit. So we say a state pi j is one player reachable from pi k. So instead of saying it's one player different, we're now saying it's reachable. If and only if there exists a player I, which is the I that enabled the one player difference, it has to have a non-negative utility change. So that you're saying that if I'm going to be able to go from a state I to j, j to k actually, and the player I is involved in making the one player difference possible, the player I has also to get a non-negative utility change for it to be the person to move, right? So if I'm the person that I can enable us to go from this state to another, but I'm not receiving a positive payoff. Why would I do that? So that means the two states, even if they're only one player different, they're not reachable. That's that end. And then this further restricts the transition amongst the different states in the game. Essentially, reachability requires that player has to bear no loss of utility. It has to be on either increased or unchanged to enable transition from one state to another. There are a few other utility-related concepts in the abstract model. The relative power of a player denoted between 0 and 1. And then we simply sum up the power of the members to get the relative power of the coalitions. And in the model, we further denote the position of a player I in n-dimensional objective space as pi, which is essentially a vector of dimension n. And then we illustrate the concept in the following figure. I'll show the figure shortly. And where you have two objective dimensions here and four groups in play. So this is where we have the objective dimensions here, one being about the form of government, democratic or totalitarian, and the nature of the state being secular or religious, and have different players occupying the space. And we have also utility function dictating the payoffs by joining alliance with another person, and that means the further apart you are in the objective space, the less of a payoff you're receiving from that coalition you're in. And there's a concept of negotiated position for a coalition. If you're familiar with the concept of center of mass, what we say here is that we propose that the negotiated position will simply be a similar concept with the equation as following. Essentially, the more powerful you are in a particular alliances, the negotiated position of the alliance will be closer to your armed position. Is that understandable? So if you're a very powerful state, in the real world, if you have very powerful negotiations with a weaker counterparty, the eventual realized negotiation outcome will be closer to yours, simply because you have more resources dictating it. And that's also empirically validated through a lot of research. And there's also a weighted version. I think I'll skip the details there. That's not quite important here. And then that's the realizable utility. So we write realizable utility, which means the payoff you're expecting to receive, you basically are going to receive with the coalition is going to be the winning one. That's purely dependent upon the Euclidean distance between the position of coalition and the position of yourself. So the UIS, which is the player's I's view of the utility of coalition S, is a function of the distance between the position of the coalition and the position of itself. And this should be no greater than UI itself. It's strictly decreasing. And UI is the maximum realizable utility player enjoy. So if you think about the actual situations, is that if you purely think in terms of the policy space, you're a political party or simply a country with a position, it is best for you if you are to win by yourself, right? So you keep everything you have. And when you're trying to join an alliance and there's a negotiation process and the realized position of the alliance moves away from your own position, your utility decreases. And I think here you probably wonder if whenever I join an alliance, my utility decreases, what is the motivation for me to join an alliance and have a negotiated position that's further away from where I am at all? And that's where the size come into play. And we propose the definition of expected utility based on the realizable utility and the relative power of the coalition. So the expected utility takes in two components into consideration. The one being what we talk about, the distance between your objective position and that of the group, and the other being the relative power of the coalition you're in. So you could be receiving less of a promised policy position, but you could be in a more powerful alliance, so you have a greater chance of winning. And these two, the product of the two, dictated by certain functions, will give you the expected utility. And in the extended form, we combine the definition of realizable utility. We define the expected utility as following, where G is a function created to capture the positive correlation between the power of the coalition and the higher likelihood to fulfill its promises to the members. So, questions? Yeah.
Relative power is for an agent or is for the coalition?
Relative power, so each agent carries a relative power. And the relative power of the coalition is dictated by the members it contains. So it's basically the sum of the power of all its members. Does that make sense? Okay.
So, but an agent does not know the uniform of the other agent.
Oh, it is. We assume the information to be transparent in this model. Yep. Yeah. Okay. So now we have pretty much defined the expected utility and the way the state moves. Now we talk about stability concepts. As you probably know, the stability concept has many variations, and we talk about 5 ways of variating it. And the first one, the solution concept itself, could be Nash or Pareto. Nash means you can, when it's stable, it means no player is able to unilaterally being better off without consideration for others. And Pareto means you cannot be better off without making others worse off. And then the decision horizon can either be myopic or far-sighted. So you could be only thinking about the immediate outcome, or be thinking about the next immediate outcome, or further. There are even ones that takes the discounted value into consideration. And there's also the collaborative moves. We talk about one-player difference, which means to move from one state to another. Well, one player needs to do it, but there could also be colluding, and you can have an n-player joint move. And there's transferable utility part. You can have a TU game. You can have a non-TU game. And there's also allow moves. It could have a non-cooperative, non-binding game, or the game itself, the outcomes of each tick could be partially binding. Well, with all the 5 variations, you actually would have 2 to the power of 5. How much is that? 32 variations of stability concept. And I think it's a bit confusing which path we should take for the abstract model. So when I have to make the choice, because it's my dissertation, to discover and actually characterize the stability concepts here, I had 2 major considerations. First one being the computational complexity, the other being the empirical relevance. And this is what I find the most relevant concept for us in terms of the stability concept in the abstract model. So you want it to be Nash because the players are just selfish. You want them to be myopic because this allows you to have a better, this is better for computational complexity considerations because you would have smaller decision space. Yes? Sorry? Yes, please. Yes, others have to accept you. Mm-hmm. That's an excellent question here. So thanks for clarifying that for me. The unilateral decision is to leave the coalition. In order to join a coalition, the protocol here is that every member of the coalition you're trying to join have to have a non-negative payoff. So anyone hates you, you couldn't join. Does that make sense? And I mean, there could be, sorry. So you don't allow an agent to leave. So anyone, if you think about the actual situations, the real world scenario is that if I don't feel like being in this coalition, I can just walk away, right? But if I actually want to be in a particular coalition, majority of the members at least have to agree for me to join, right? And that's how we run the model. But in the abstract version, we simply keep it as every member of the coalition you're trying to join have to have a non-negative utility change with you being a new member. Does that make sense? Yeah. That simplifies things dramatically. And then also we assume a one-player move because it's smaller decision space again, and in real-world scenarios for intrastate conflicts, it's very unlikely for them to collude. Please. Yes.
So then I get all the benefit, but no cost. I mean, at the end of the day, the
yes.
average will be
yes.
what I was at the beginning.
Yeah, and it's actually your point is exactly right. So you are only you would be thinking about the negotiated position. If they are equal and you are right in the middle, you're benefiting by just being in the middle, and there's no payment for you, and you are more powerful because you're in a coalition now, right? And this actually happens a lot in real world. So if you're able to play counterparties and bring them to a point of agreement where you most enjoy, then you profit. Does that? Yeah. It is allowed, and it's perfectly, and also makes perfect empirical sense. Yeah. And then it's non-TU, so transferable utility is not really allowed in the games because it changes so fast, and you don't really think about end games. And also in intrastate conflict, I don't really think anybody's willing to share. And that's actually also a part of the Gamson's law because, remember, it doesn't depend on process. It only depends on the topology of the coalition structure for the payoffs. And the things are non-binding, which means the clauses are as they stand. Well, there are a few questions about the stability concepts from the previous slide. The first one being, do stable states exist? And the answer here is probably. And I think following that question is that what happens if the stable states do not exist? And there are two observed phenomena here in our simulations from the preliminary results. One being simply going through a cycle, and we'll show that in a bit. The other being just going on a random walk. Yeah. So I think we saw that in one of the simplest two-player plays. You're going to a random walk if it's a non-cooperative game with the myopic agents. There was a remark I struck out. I was saying there are no cycles of length 2 in the state diagram. Actually, there can be. If you have, I think, we don't have chalk here. Okay. Do I have chalk? Yeah. So basically, if you think about different states in the game, if you initialize to S1, there will be many variations of it that you can possibly reach. And maybe you can go here, and then you can go to S4, and so forth. And you see here, you would actually have a stable state. But if I complex things join here, I think you can get a random walk. And there's pretty much a cycle here because the state diagram itself contains only 5 nodes. I had an argument earlier I struck out is that there are no cycles of length 2 because I was thinking you can't do this. Because S3 and S4, by early definition, has to be one player different, and they have to both to be one player reachable. But this is possible if the agent I involved in this transition is having a strictly unchanged utility. So it basically fluctuates, oscillates between the two. Does that make sense for you? So following up the earlier example for U, let's say U3 of equal distance, equal power, and you could basically join a collision with him, or you can join a collision with her. For you, the payoff is exactly the same. Does that make sense to you? Yeah. So you could have actually a cycle of length 2. Never mind. The abstract model. So if we are able to write so many things about the abstract model and actually have all the things nicely defined, the stability concepts and all those things, why do we even bother to do a computational modeling of it? I think it really falls back to the question of the computation complexity. I didn't talk about the Bell numbers earlier, but let's recall the Bell numbers. The simple question, the Bell numbers is used for capturing the number of possible partitions given a set of a size n. So if you have, say, a set of 3, and the Bell number to it is 5, which means you can have 5 partitions of this set. And you think about it, it's 1, 2, 3 being alone, 1, 2 being together. I'm not going to exhaustively list all those things. But then you get the idea is that the Bell numbers increases beyond exponentially. What happens is that there's actually an interesting graph on Wikipedia. You can see about a way to add up the Bell numbers in a pyramid. So I can't quite recall that. But there's an asymptotic bound for Bell numbers, and it's basically saying that the Bn is bounded by the big O notation of almost n over log n to the power of n. And what happens here is that for a simple number of players, like 12, you would have over 4 million partitions, which means there are 4 million states of the game, right? That's only 12 players. You have 4 million possible states, and if you do the simple calculation, you think about a walkthrough of computing utility, you think about one player difference, all these things, the computing complexity associated with those things are essentially to construct the entire state diagram as we have here for 12 players, not really 12 players, but that would be n to the power of 2 times the Bn, the Bell number n. And this is a graph you see from Wolfram Alpha, is that beyond 15, not even to 20, you have a number of 1.4 to the power to the 10 to the power of 15 or more computations necessary. And it's not possible. And so now forced back to the question, if we're not able to find a tractable solution from the abstract model, what do we do? Well, agent-based modeling comes to the rescue. It's kind of a cheating in a way, but not really, because I'll explain in a bit. So the whole idea is that we transform definitions of the concepts into agent rules. We would explore all reachable state from current state from an agent perspective. We would quickly discard with an algorithm by compare all the possible states to the baseline utility. The baseline utility is the utility received by being solely on your own. So that way, you do a quick comparison, you can discard a good number of reachable states or one-player different states from current situation. And also by limiting only explore the all reachable states from current state, you will dramatically reduce the actual computational space you have to explore. And then you mark the move according to the protocol and repeat the whole process. And if you only look at the next possible state, and then you do a simulation of, say, t ticks, so everything discrete, and you're having a computation complexity that's bounded by the Beagle notation of t times the n to the power of 2. And there are pros and cons with it. I think that first of all, the pros would be you're able to find the solutions a lot quicker. But the con is that because you only run a limited number of computations, it is very likely you will miss on other stable states, very likely you will miss on the cycles and random walks, and very likely in many situations we actually did for complex games that you're simply not able to find a stable state at all, and you're not able to draw a conclusive decision about what exactly is happening. Because you're running a number of 50 ticks or 100 ticks or 1,000, and you don't find a unstable state, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It probably simply that you haven't gone to the part of the state diagram where there is a cycle or there is a stable state. Yeah. And then justification for doing so. Remember that this has after all, it has a real-world empirical relevance. And what happens in the real world is that the moves happen over time, and given the horizon of study for any scenario with the initial conditions, there's only a limited number of ticks that's possible. If you think about a country that starts with fragmented factions and they start making moves about coalition formations, it's not likely they're going to go through 1,000 ticks. Most of the real-world coalition dynamics, most of the games in the real world are played on 100 times. So if you're able to explore all the things that happen within the 100 ticks, that's fairly reasonable, a good solution that can have derive enough empirical insights. Well, there are a few, so that's the future work, a few hypotheses we're testing at the moment. So we're thinking about more even power distribution leads to a more chaotic process, or things like as the power changes for leading agent and coalition, the coalition dissembles or actually grows in size. And then we also do a case study to validate some of the hypotheses in the real world. One of the ongoing projects actually we're studying the Syrian civil war. It's an ongoing multi-party conflict with international interventions taking place in Syria. It's been going on for quite a few years, and there's very little hope of ending anytime soon. And we have power changes, weight shifts, so different concerns on different object dimensions, and also elimination of some smaller groups in the process. And that's all very interesting dynamics for us to observe with the agent-based model and also testing with the findings in the abstract model. So this is actually an output of the state charts. So I'll explain a little bit here. The evolution of coalitions in a standalone module done in Python and fictional A states with 10 ticks. The color you see here, when it's gray, it means it's by itself and not in any coalition. When they are of the same color, that means they're in the same coalition. So you see evolution here is that the two small players go together and then the other one go together. And because of feeling threatened by this part, the brown ones form a coalition, but somehow the smaller ones find it more attractive. I think it goes here. And then there's all these interesting dynamics. And you see side switchings, you see fragmentation of the coalitions, and you see formation of some mega coalitions, and even the side switching of larger players in a game. And also we have done this as an integrated module to the state sim, where we have different parties. We have a total of 14 factions in Syria, and we studied the church-state separation dimension, and then the broker peace anarchy or peace. We have actually 2 more dimensions. We can't really show a 4-dimensional space here, but you kind of get the idea. And actually can quickly show you how it looks like. So you have basically the 4 dimensions here, and this is a unidimensional view when you have both of the exhibit dimensions being the same thing, and then you see the collisions on those dimensions along the sticks. Sorry? Sorry? It's not showing anything? Oh, sorry. It's actually on my... Oh, it's here now. Let me see for a way to show it. Is now showing? No? Okay. Sorry. Christ. Okay. So there's something here, and then you change the dimension, and you have different objective here, and then you're going through the different ticks in the simulation. And you see the changes here in terms of the correlation structures. Now let's go back to the last slide. Well, that's pretty much all I have for today, and thank you very much. Any questions or comments? Would you mind speaking a bit louder? Probability of success is actually left. So the position of a coalition is computed as the center of the mass, right? Of different positions of different players with different power. The chance of success is simply computed as a function of the power that's dependent on power. And at the moment, we're simply doing the power of the coalition versus the power, the total available relative power in the scenario. But there can be different variations. It could be exponential, it could be logarithmic, but we don't know. And that's something I left open for the power of a coalition. Sorry?
What do you mean by the power of
the power of a coalition? So, we had a relative power defined as Ri. So for each player, it's 0 to 1, right? And the power of a coalition, S, is basically the sum of all the i's in S, Ri. You just sum everything up. Yeah. And then the chance of success, so probability of success for S, at the moment, we say it's a function of Rs. But then in practice, what we do is we kind of write things like Rs over the summation of all the power, relative power available in a scenario. Yeah. But, this thing doesn't necessarily have to be a simple ratio. It could be, you probably can add a log to it or add I don't know. This is something that I need to look further into literature. But for the moment, for building the model, as long as we capture this positive relationship, positive correlation, I think it's fine for now, yeah.
What does RI really mean? What is power?
Power is basically the composite variable which represents the capacity of the player to alter the outcome of the states or the chance of success in the conflict.
Yeah, how do you measure that?
That is basically, for the abstract model, we simply assign a number. For the actual ABM, we work as SMEs, so we would basically do a composite number from the military power, the economic resources, and maybe the region they control, things like that. Yeah. Any other? Yes?
So you're simulating this for the Syrian civil war going on now. Have you done it for past conflicts? Where you know the ending and would see?
You mean back testing, right?
Yeah.
So not really. There are some civil wars that have been going on in the past, but you think about the scale of civil wars with probably 10 or more parties that's been going on for a while. A lot of those civil wars are actually in Africa, and those data are missing, right? So if you want a well-documented civil war with enough data to support this model, feed in this model, to give it enough of empirical sense to run it, I think you would be looking at civil wars in the past decade or two. and there are not that many of that scale. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for coming. I hope you enjoy the topic. Yeah.